Imagine being told your idea is stupid, reckless, even treasonous. Now imagine that same idea saving an entire nation from annihilation and arming 6 million soldiers with nothing but scrap metal and sheer desperation. This is the story of how one humble factory foreman's so-called stupid trick became the most brilliant act of wartime ingenuity in human history, and how the Soviet Union transformed junk into the weapon that broke the Nazi war machine. Before we dive into this incredible journey, drop a comment below and tell me where you're watching from and whether you've ever heard of the PPSh-41, the gun that changed everything. Hit that like button if you're ready for a story that Hollywood couldn't write better if it tried. June 22, 1941. Operation Barbarossa. 3 million Nazi soldiers crash across the Soviet border like a tidal wave of steel and fire. Within weeks, the Wehrmacht has carved deep into Soviet territory, destroying factories, obliterating supply lines, and leaving the Red Army reeling in chaos. The numbers are catastrophic. Millions of Soviet soldiers are being mobilized. Peasants pulled from fields, workers yanked from assembly lines, students ripped from classrooms. They're given uniforms if they're lucky. They're given boots sometimes. But weapons? There aren't nearly enough weapons. Stalin's generals stand in dimly lit war rooms, staring at maps that show the front collapsing like a house of cards. They know the brutal mathematics of modern war. Without guns, soldiers are just targets. The Soviet Union is staring into the abyss, and the abyss is staring back with swastikas in its eyes. This isn't just about losing territory. This is about the potential extinction of the Soviet state, the enslavement of millions, the erasure of a people. The pressure is unimaginable. Someone, somewhere, needs a miracle. Enter Alexei Sudayev. Not a general, not a famous weapons designer, not even a decorated engineer. Just a foreman at a Moscow factory. A man who understood metal and machinery the way a musician understands rhythm. Broad-shouldered, calloused hands, a face weathered by years of factory floors, and the acrid smell of hot steel. Alexei wasn't born into privilege. He grew up in the brutal practicality of Soviet industrial life, where you learned to make something from nothing because nothing was usually all you had. His father was a metal worker who died in a factory accident when Alexei was 12. His mother worked as a seamstress, her fingers bleeding onto fabric just to keep food on the table. Alexei learned early that life doesn't give you what you need. You take what life throws away and you make it useful. By 1941, Alexei had spent 2 decades in Soviet factories, moving from apprentice to foreman, watching weapons being manufactured with meticulous precision, expensive materials, and highly trained craftsmen. He saw the complexity, the cost, the time. And when the Nazi invasion shattered the Soviet industrial heartland, when factories were bombed into rubble and machinery was evacuated east on trains packed with desperate civilians, Alexei saw something else, an opportunity hidden inside catastrophe. The existing Soviet submachine guns, the PPD-40s, were excellent weapons, beautifully machined, reliable, accurate. They were also expensive, time-consuming to produce, and required skilled machinists and quality steel that the USSR no longer had in sufficient quantities. The factories that could produce them were either destroyed or operating at a fraction of capacity. Meanwhile, Nazi troops were pushing deeper into Soviet territory every single day, and millions of Soviet soldiers were being sent to the front with bolt-action rifles against enemies armed with automatic weapons. It was a massacre waiting to happen. One evening in late 1941, in a cramped planning room thick with cigarette smoke and the weight of impending disaster, Alexei stood before a panel of military officials, weapons designers, and Communist Party overseers. These men wore crisp uniforms, had strategic maps spread before them, and spoke in the language of protocol and proper procedure. Alexei wore a factory worker's coveralls stained with grease and sweat. The contrast was stark, almost comical. One of the officials barely looked up when Alexei was introduced. Alexei cleared his throat. His voice was rough, unpolished, but steady. "Comrades, I have a proposal for producing submachine guns. Many submachine guns. Millions of them." A few heads turned. One designer, a decorated engineer named Volkov, who had spent years perfecting intricate firearms mechanisms, leaned back with a smirk. "We're already working on production optimization, Foreman. Unless you've discovered a way to make steel appear from thin air, I don't see how a factory floor supervisor can help with weapons design." The room chuckled. Polite, dismissive, the kind of laughter that says, "Know your place." But Alexei didn't flinch. He had expected this. He'd been dismissed his entire life by men who confused credentials with capability. "I'm not proposing better steel, comrade," Alexei said calmly. "I'm proposing we stop needing it." The chuckling stopped. Volkov's smirk faded into a frown. Explain. Alexei stepped forward and placed a crude blueprint on the table. It looked almost insultingly simple. A tube, a bolt, a spring, a wooden stock, minimal parts, maximum function. We build a submachine gun from stamped sheet metal. No expensive machining, no precision milling. We use metal that's been rejected from other projects, scrap from damaged machinery, even plumbing pipes if necessary. We design it so that any worker, even someone who's never touched a gun before, can assemble it with basic tools. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes either revolution or execution. Another official, a party representative named Commissar Petrov, slammed his hand on the table. His face was red. His voice sharp with indignation. Are you seriously proposing we arm the Red Army with garbage? With plumbing pipes? This is not just stupid, Foreman, it borders on sabotage. Alexei met his eyes, unwavering. Comrade Commissar, right now we have soldiers fighting tanks with bottles of gasoline and courage. I'm proposing we give them something better than courage. I'm proposing we give them firepower. Lots of it. And I'm proposing we do it fast. Because every day we debate quality versus quantity. More. Soviet soldiers die. Volkov leaned forward, his tone dripping with condescension. Foreman Sudayev. Weapons design is not about slapping metal together and hoping it works. There are tolerances, specifications, safety standards. What you're suggesting would produce inferior weapons that might explode in our soldiers' hands, jam in combat, fail when needed most. You're talking about killing our own men. The room murmured in agreement. Alexei could feel the weight of their judgment. Their certainty that he was a foolish laborer, stepping far beyond his understanding. But Alexei had spent his life in the place where theory meets reality, where beautiful blueprints collide with the limitations of broken machinery and exhausted workers. He knew something these educated men didn't. Sometimes the perfect is the enemy of the good enough. Comrade designer, Alexei said, his voice lower now, more deliberate. I've watched men with your credentials design magnificent weapons that took 6 months to produce and required craftsmen we no longer have. I respect your expertise. But the Nazis don't care about our design philosophy. They care about bullets. And right now, they're firing more of them than we are. The tension in the room was palpable. You could hear men breathing, the scratch of a pen as someone took notes, the distant rumble of trucks outside carrying supplies east, away from the advancing enemy. Petrov pointed a finger at Alexei like a weapon. If we authorize this, madness and it fails, the blood of Soviet soldiers will be on your hands, Foreman. And failures in wartime are not forgiven. It was a threat, barely veiled. Fail, and you face the gulag, or worse. But Alexei had made his calculation. Do nothing, and the Soviet Union might not survive the year. Try something radical, and there's a chance. A slim chance, but a chance nonetheless. Give me 1 month, Alexei said. 1 factory, a crew of whoever you can spare, and access to scrap materials. If I can't produce a working, reliable submachine gun that can be mass-produced by unskilled labor, then you can dismiss me, arrest me, shoot me, whatever you think is just. But if I succeed, you authorize full production immediately. The officials looked at each other. The math was brutal but simple. They were desperate. Finally, a senior military officer named General Volsky, a man who had survived Stalin's purges by being ruthlessly practical, nodded slowly. 1 month, Foreman. But understand this. If your weapon fails in combat, if it jams and gets our soldiers killed, your name will be synonymous with treason. Alexei nodded. Understood, Comrade General. I'll deliver something that works, or I won't deliver at all. And so began the most intense month of Alexei Sudayev's life. He was given a small, partially damaged factory on the outskirts of Moscow. A skeleton crew of workers, many of them women and teenagers because most men were already at the front, and access to what could generously be called materials, but was more accurately described as whatever hadn't been blown up yet. The crew looked at Alexei with a mix of hope and skepticism. They were exhausted, terrified, mourning family members killed in bombings or sent to fight. One young woman, barely 17, named Katya, approached Alexei on the first day. Her hands were small, delicate, more suited to a school desk than a factory floor. Comrade Foreman, she said quietly, I've never built anything more complicated than a radio. How are we supposed to build guns? Alexei looked at her, then at the others, these unlikely soldiers of the home front. Katya, I'm going to teach you not how to build a complicated gun, but how to build a simple one. And sometimes simple is exactly what wins wars. He broke the design down into components so basic that each person could master one small task. Stamping sheet metal, bending tubes, cutting wood for stocks, assembling springs. No single worker needed to understand the entire weapon, just their small piece of it. It was revolutionary in its simplicity, almost insulting to traditional gunsmiths, but it worked. The prototype emerged after 2 weeks of round-the-clock work. It was crude-looking, boxy, utilitarian. It had none of the elegance of the PPD-40, but when Alexei took it to the testing range with General Volsky and designer Volkov watching with barely concealed skepticism, something extraordinary happened. He loaded the drum magazine, aimed at targets downrange, and squeezed the trigger. The PPSh-41, as it would come to be known, roared to life. 750 rounds per minute. Reliable cycling. Consistent accuracy at close range. He fired continuously until the magazine was empty. Then he dunked the weapon in a barrel of filthy water, pulled it out, loaded another magazine, and fired again. Perfect function. He threw it on the ground, kicked dirt over it, picked it up, and fired. Perfect function. The silence from the observers was deafening. Volkov's face had gone pale. General Volsky's expression shifted from skepticism to something approaching awe. "Mother of God," the general whispered. "It actually works." Alexei, covered in gunsmoke and grime, turned to face them. "It works, Comrade General, and we can build thousands of them. Tens of thousands, millions. We can build them in workshops, in basements, in train depots. We can build them with workers who've never seen a gun before. We can arm the entire Red Army with weapons that cost a fraction of what we're spending now and work in conditions that would destroy a precision rifle." But Volkov wasn't ready to concede. His professional pride, his years of careful work, everything he believed about proper engineering, it all rebelled against what he was seeing. "It's still crude, Foreman. It lacks the refinement, the refinement to die beautifully?" Alexei interrupted, his voice sharp now, the patience wearing thin. "Comrade, designer, I respect your knowledge, truly I do. But this weapon isn't designed to win awards. It's designed to win a war. And in war, the side that puts more bullets downrange faster usually wins." General Volsky stepped forward, placing a hand on Alexei's shoulder. "Foreman Sudayev, I'm authorizing immediate mass production. Whatever you need, whatever resources, whatever authority, you have it. The Soviet Union is placing its faith in your stupid trick." The word stupid hung in the air, but now it carried a different weight. What had been an insult was becoming a badge of honor, a reminder that sometimes the most brilliant solutions look foolish to the educated elite until they prove themselves in the crucible of reality. Within weeks, factories across the Soviet Union were retooled for PPSh-41 production. Alexei traveled from site to site, training new crews, solving problems, improvising solutions. In Leningrad, under siege and starving, workers built PPSh-41s in basement workshops by candlelight. In the Urals, where factories had been evacuated, production lines assembled them in converted warehouses. In Stalingrad, even as the city burned around them, weapons workshops produced PPSh-41s from salvaged metal. The scale was unprecedented. By early 1942, thousands of PPSh-41s were reaching the front lines every week. By mid-1942, it was tens of thousands. Soldiers who had been fighting with single-shot rifles suddenly found themselves armed with submachine guns that could lay down devastating curtains of fire. The impact on combat was immediate and dramatic. But not everyone was convinced. Commissar Petrov, the party representative who had called Alexei's idea sabotage, became increasingly vocal in his criticism. Reports came back from the front of PPSh-41s jamming in extreme cold, of soldiers complaining about the weight of the drum magazines, of officers preferring the more refined German MP40s captured in combat. Petrov seized on these reports. In a heated meeting in Moscow in the spring of 1942, with Alexei present along with military leadership, Petrov stood and pointed an accusing finger. "Comrades, I warned you this would happen. Foreman Sudayev's cheap weapon is failing our soldiers. We have reports of malfunctions, complaints from the front, and now I have information," he paused dramatically, pulling out a document, "that Foreman Sudayev has been using substandard materials, cutting corners beyond even his original proposal, possibly diverting resources for personal gain." The room erupted. The accusation was serious, potentially fatal. In Stalin's Soviet Union, accusations of corruption or sabotage during wartime meant show trials and execution. Alexei felt his blood run cold, but he kept his face impassive. He had expected something like this. Men like Petrov needed scapegoats, needed to be right, needed to maintain their positions of power. General Volsky slammed his fist on the table. Commissar, those are serious charges. What evidence do you have? Petrov smiled, a cruel twist of his lips. The evidence is in the inferior performance, Comrade General. A truly loyal Soviet worker, a true patriot, would never have suggested such a crude approach. I believe Foreman Sudayev's working-class background, his lack of proper political education, has made him susceptible to what exactly? A new voice cut through the room like a blade. Everyone turned. In the doorway stood a figure few had expected. Marshal Georgy Zhukov himself, the Soviet Union's most decorated and respected military commander, the man who would later accept Nazi Germany's surrender. Zhukov walked into the room, his presence commanding instant silence. He was a man who had seen more combat, more death, more desperate situations than everyone else in the room combined. His uniform was dusty from travel, his face grim. Commissar Petrov, I just came from the Rzhev salient. Do you know what I saw there? Petrov stammered. Comrade Marshal, I was merely presenting concerns about. I saw Soviet soldiers armed with PPSh-41s holding positions against German forces with superior numbers and better equipment. Zhukov continued, his voice like iron. I saw conscripts who'd been farmers 3 months ago using Sudayev's weapon to break German infantry assaults. I saw the weapon perform in -30-degree weather, in mud, in conditions that would make a German MP-40 weep. And do you know what those soldiers told me when I asked about their weapons? The room was utterly silent. Petrov's face had gone pale. They told me it's the best thing the motherland has given them, Zhukov said. They told me they trust it with their lives. They call it the papasha, the little father. And you, Commissar, sitting in your warm Moscow office, dare to call this man's work inferior, dare to accuse him of sabotage. Zhukov turned to Alexei, and for the first time his granite expression softened slightly. Foreman. Sudayev, come forward. Alexei stepped forward, his heart pounding. This could go either way. Zhukov was known for both rewarding brilliance and executing failure with equal efficiency. Do you know why your weapon works so well, Foreman? Zhukov asked. Because it's simple, Comrade Marshal. Alexei replied quietly. Because soldiers in combat don't need complexity. They need reliability. Zhukov nodded. You understand war better than half my officers. But there's something else you should know. He reached into his coat and pulled out a worn, battered PPSh-41. It was scarred, dented, the woodstock cracked and repaired with wire. This weapon belonged to a soldier named Mikhail Volkov, Zhukov said, and at the name, Designer Volkov, who had been silent throughout the meeting, suddenly looked up, his face stricken. Mikhail Volkov? The designer whispered. That's my son. Zhukov nodded slowly, his expression softening with a grief that transcended rank. Your son was a hero, Designer Volkov. He held a position at Stalingrad for 6 hours against overwhelming German forces. He saved 32 of his comrades. He did it with this weapon, Sudayev's so-called crude design. He died holding the line, but his unit survived. And before he died, he asked a comrade to make sure his father knew. The PPSh-41 never failed him. Not once. The room seemed to shatter. Designer Volkov's face crumpled, years of professional rivalry and intellectual pride collapsing under the weight of unimaginable grief. He stood shakily, walked to Alexei, and the two men stood facing each other, an engineer who had mocked a foreman, and a foreman who had been right. I'm sorry, Volkov whispered, his voice breaking. I'm so sorry. I was arrogant. I was blind. You saved my son's life, even if only for a few more hours. You gave him a chance to be a hero. And I called your work stupid. Alexei, this man of steel and practicality, felt tears prick his eyes. He had lost his own family to the war, and he understood this pain more deeply than anyone knew. He reached out and gripped Volkov's shoulder. Your son was brave, comrade. And his bravery, and the bravery of millions like him, that's what makes the weapon matter. I just made the tool. They're the ones using it to save our nation. Petrov, sensing the tide turning catastrophically against him, tried to speak. Comrade Marshal, I was only expressing legitimate concerns about protecting your own position. Zhukov cut him off coldly. About maintaining the illusion that only the educated elite can save the Soviet Union. Commissar Petrov, you're being reassigned. To the front. Perhaps there you'll learn the value of simplicity and the cost of arrogance. It wasn't a death sentence, but it might as well have been. Frontline assignments for political officers were brutally dangerous. Petrov's face drained of color, but he knew better than to protest a marshal's order. He left the room like a ghost. His power stripped away in seconds. Zhukov turned back to the assembly. Comrades, we are winning this war one bullet at a time. One soldier at a time. One stupid trick at a time. Foreman Sudayev, the Soviet Union owes you a debt it can never fully repay. Your weapon has armed over 2 million soldiers already. And before this war ends, it will arm millions more. You have been awarded the Order of Lenin and the title of Hero of Socialist Labor. But Alexei wasn't thinking about medals. He was thinking about Mikhail Volkov, and the countless other Mikhails, and the Katyas back in the factories, and the desperate mathematics of war, where every day, every hour, every minute counted. Comrade Marshal, Alexei said quietly, I don't need medals. I need more steel, more workers, and permission to keep simplifying the design. We can make it even cheaper, even faster. We can make sure every soldier has one. That's all the honor I need. Zhukov smiled, a rare expression on his weathered face. Then, you'll have it, Foreman, whatever you need. And so the production continued, accelerated, exploded across the Soviet Union. By 1943, the PPSh-41 was ubiquitous on the Eastern Front. By 1944, it had become legendary. By the time the Red Army marched into Berlin in 1945, over 6 million PPSh-41s had been produced, making it one of the most mass-produced weapons in human history. The impact was staggering. Soviet infantry squads armed with PPSh-41s could lay down firepower that rivaled machine gun positions. In close-quarters urban combat like Stalingrad, the weapon was devastating. In forest combat, in winter warfare, in the desperate close-range fighting of the Eastern Front, the PPSh-41 gave Soviet soldiers a fighting chance against an enemy that had invaded with technological and tactical superiority. The weapon became part of Soviet culture. Songs were written about it. Soldiers carved their initials into the woodstocks. It appeared in propaganda posters, in newsreels, in the hands of Soviet heroes. The Papasha had become more than a weapon. It had become a symbol of Soviet resilience, of the ability to turn scrap into salvation, of the wisdom hidden in working-class hands. But perhaps the most profound transformation was in designer Volkov. After learning of his son's heroism and death, Volkov threw himself into improving Alexei's design, not to compete with it, but to honor it. The two men worked together, the educated engineer and the practical foreman, combining their knowledge to make minor refinements that increased reliability even further. Volkov publicly praised Alexei's work, gave lectures about the importance of practical design over theoretical perfection, and became one of the weapon's most passionate advocates. Years later, in 1946, after the war had ended and the Soviet Union was rebuilding from the ashes, Alexei stood in a Moscow factory, now a celebrated designer in his own right, watching a new generation of workers assembling weapons. Katya, the young woman who had been 17 and terrified in 1941, was now a senior supervisor, teaching others the techniques Alexei had taught her. An elderly man approached Alexei, walking with a cane, wearing a veteran's medals. He was missing his left arm, lost at Kursk. Comrade Sudayev? He asked. Alexei turned. Yes, comrade. The veteran's eyes were wet. I just wanted to shake your hand. I carried a papasha from Stalingrad to Berlin. It saved my life 17 times that I can count. Probably more that I can't. I don't know if you remember this, but you're the reason I'm alive. You're the reason my children exist. I needed you to know that. Alexei took the man's remaining hand and shook it firmly. Comrade, you saved yourself. You and millions like you. I just made sure you had the tool to do it. The veteran smiled. They told us you were just a foreman, someone who got lucky with a stupid idea. But I know better. You understood something all those educated men didn't. Sometimes the best weapon isn't the most sophisticated one. Sometimes the best weapon is the one that works when you need it most, that doesn't quit on you, that's there in your hands when everything else has fallen apart. You gave us that. You gave us a chance. After the veteran left, Alexei stood alone in the factory for a moment, listening to the rhythmic sounds of production. The same sounds he'd heard his entire life. He thought about his father, who died making things. He thought about designer Volkov's son, who died using something Alexei made. He thought about all the lives saved, all the lives lost. The terrible arithmetic of war where genius and luck and desperation combined to create history. The PPSh-41 would go on to be used in conflicts around the world for decades. It would appear in the Korean War, in Vietnam, in countless revolutions and insurgencies. But its true legacy was deeper than just military effectiveness. It represented a philosophical revolution in how humanity thinks about problem-solving in crisis. When the educated elite said something was impossible, a working-class foreman said, "Let me try." When sophisticated people demanded perfection, a practical man delivered good enough, and good enough turned out to be perfect. When the system said you needed expensive materials and years of training, one innovator proved you could achieve more with scrap metal and determination than with pristine resources and hesitation. The story of the PPSh-41 is the story of every underestimated person who ever had an idea dismissed as stupid. It's the story of every time simplicity defeated complexity, every time practical wisdom trumped theoretical knowledge, every time someone with calloused hands and a clear vision changed the world while educated skeptics stood by in shock. It's the story of how one man's stupid trick became the weapon that helped defeat the Nazi war machine, armed millions, saved countless lives, and proved that sometimes the most revolutionary acts come not from the top of society looking down, but from the bottom looking up and saying, "I have a better way." 6 million weapons, one humble foreman, one moment where he chose to speak up despite knowing he'd be mocked, one decision to trust his instincts over the voices of authority, and the world changed. So the next time someone calls your idea stupid, the next time someone dismisses your innovation because you lack the right credentials, the next time you're tempted to stay silent because you're just a worker, just a foreman, just someone without fancy degrees or connections, remember Alexei Sudayev. Remember that sometimes stupid ideas save nations, and sometimes the most brilliant minds in the room are wearing work boots instead of medals. If this story moved you, if it made you think differently about who gets to be a genius and what true innovation looks like, smash that like button and share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more stories of history's unsung heroes, the people who changed everything while everyone else was busy explaining why their ideas couldn't work. Drop a comment telling me what stupid trick you've been hesitating to try, what idea you've been afraid to voice because you think no one will take you seriously. Because here's the truth. The world doesn't change when the powerful decide to allow it. The world changes when ordinary people refuse to accept. That ordinary isn't enough. When someone with a practical mind and desperate courage stands up and says, "I have an idea, and I don't care if you think it's stupid. Let me show you it works." That's how wars are won. That's how nations are saved. That's how 6 million weapons came from scrap metal and sheer human brilliance. That's the power of the stupid trick that changed history. The years rolled forward like the tracks of a T-34 tank, grinding through time, leaving deep impressions in the earth of history. Alexei Sudayev continued his work in Soviet weapons design, but the PPSh-41 remained his masterpiece, the creation that defined him. He never sought the spotlight. Even when Western military historians began studying the weapon, analyzing its impact on the Eastern Front, Alexei remained in his factories, in his workshops, doing what he had always done, solving problems with his hands and his practical mind. But the ripples of his innovation spread far beyond the Soviet Union, far beyond World War II, far beyond even his own lifetime. The PPSh-41 became a case study in military academies around the world, not just as a weapon, but as a philosophy. The Sudayev principle, as some came to call it, became shorthand for a revolutionary approach to wartime production, radical simplification, acceptance of imperfection, prioritization of quantity and reliability over sophistication and prestige. In the decades after the war, as the Cold War froze the world into two armed camps, the PPSh-41 continued to appear in conflicts across the globe. Vietnamese guerrillas carried them in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Korean soldiers wielded them in the frozen mountains of the 38th parallel. African revolutionaries learned to strip and clean them in desert camps. The weapon became a symbol not just of Soviet power, but of a certain kind of defiance, the triumph of the practical over the prestigious, the accessible over the exclusive. Designer Volkov, transformed by grief and humility, spent the rest of his career championing what he called democratic design, weapons and tools that could be produced and maintained by ordinary people, not just technical elites. He wrote extensively about his transformation, about how his son's death had shattered his intellectual arrogance, and taught him that the purpose of engineering was not to showcase brilliance, but to serve human needs. In his final published paper, written in 1968, just months before his death, Volkov wrote, I was educated to believe that sophistication was the highest form of intelligence. Alexei Sudayev taught me that simplicity is the highest form of wisdom. My son died proving him right. I spent the rest of my life trying to be worthy of that lesson. Katya, the young woman who had trembled with fear on that first day in 1941, became one of the Soviet Union's most respected factory managers. She built a career not on weapons, but on consumer goods, applying Sudayev's principles to everything from agricultural equipment to household appliances. She often told her workers, "Comrade Sudayev taught me that if you design for the person who has the least, you create something that serves everyone. Design for the elite and you serve only the elite. Design for the desperate and you serve humanity." The veteran who approached Alexei in 1946, the man with one arm and 17 stories of survival, became a teacher. He spent decades in Moscow schools teaching history, and every year on Victory Day, he would bring his battered, retired PPSh-41 to class. He would let students hold it, feel its weight, understand its simplicity, and he would tell them, "This weapon was built by people your age, by workers who'd never built a gun before, from metal that had been thrown away, and it helped save the world. Remember that when someone tells you you're too young, too inexperienced, too ordinary to make a difference, extraordinary things come from ordinary hands when the need is great and the will is greater." Commissar Petrov, the man who had accused Alexei of treason, survived the war. He served at the front as ordered, and the experience broke something in him. Not his body, he emerged physically intact, but his certainty, his arrogance, his conviction that he understood the world. After the war, he requested reassignment to a small administrative post in a rural factory, far from Moscow, far from power. In 1952, he wrote a letter to Alexei, never sent, found among his papers after his death. "I was educated to believe that authority knew best, that those in power deserved their power because they were superior. You proved that power without wisdom is just noise, and wisdom without credentials is still wisdom. I tried to destroy you because you threatened everything I believed about how the world should work. You didn't destroy me in return. You just proved me wrong and moved on. That mercy was a greater punishment than any gulag sentence could have been. I hope someday to be worth the forgiveness you offered without me even asking for it." But perhaps the most profound epilogue belongs to the weapon itself. In 1947, a young Soviet weapons designer named Mikhail Kalashnikov began working on a new assault rifle. He had been a tank commander, wounded in combat, and during his recovery he sketched ideas for a rifle that combined the principles of several weapons he'd encountered. When he presented his early designs, senior engineers criticized them as too crude, too simple, lacking sophistication. But one engineer, an older man who had worked with Alexei Sudayev during the war, pulled Kalashnikov aside. "Young man," he said, "they told Sudayev his submachine gun was too simple. Now it's the most successful weapon of the war. Don't let sophistication be the enemy of function. If it works when everything else fails, if it can be built by anyone and used by everyone, if it's simple enough that a soldier can fix it in a foxhole, then it's not too simple, it's perfect." That rifle became the AK-47, the most produced firearm in human history, a weapon that directly inherited Sudayev's philosophy: stamped metal, minimal parts, extreme reliability, producible anywhere, maintainable by anyone. The genetic line from the PPSh-41 to the AK-47 is clear, an evolutionary leap from submachine gun to assault rifle, but carrying the same DNA. Radical simplification in service of universal accessibility. When Alexei Sudayev died in 1946, just 1 year after the war ended, he was only 33 years old. Overwork, stress, and the brutal pace of wartime production had destroyed his health. He died quietly in a Moscow hospital, surrounded not by state officials or military brass, but by factory workers, the men and women who had built his weapon and understood what he had truly accomplished. At his funeral, Marshal Zhukov himself attended, standing alongside laborers and soldiers, a unity of rank that rarely occurred in Soviet society. Zhukov said, simply, "This man understood war better than most generals. He understood that battles are won not by the most beautiful weapons, but by the most reliable ones. He understood that soldiers are not statistics, but sons and daughters who deserve tools that won't fail them. He saved more lives than any doctor, won more battles than any general, and did it all while people called his ideas stupid. The Soviet Union will remember him as a hero. I will remember him as the man who proved that genius. Wears many faces, and some of the wisest wear work boots." Designer Volkov, standing beside Zhukov, added, "He taught me that my son's life mattered more than my pride. That the right tool in the hands of a brave soldier is worth more than a perfect design that never reaches the battlefield. I called him a foreman. He was a philosopher. I thought I was educated. He was the one who truly understood. The PPSh-41 remained in Soviet military service until the 1960s, long after World War II ended. Testament to the soundness of its design. Even today, over 80 years after its creation, you can find working PPSh-41s in museums, in private collections, and occasionally in the hands of fighters in forgotten conflicts, still functioning, still reliable, still doing exactly what Alexei Sudayev designed it to do. Work when it matters most. But the true legacy of Alexei Sudayev and his stupid trick isn't measured in the 6 million weapons produced, or the countless lives saved, or even the tactical advantage it provided the Red Army. The true legacy is philosophical, a permanent challenge to how humanity thinks about innovation, expertise, and worth. It's the legacy that says, authority is not the same as wisdom. Credentials are not the same as capability. Sophistication is not the same as effectiveness. And sometimes the most revolutionary ideas come from the people society overlooks, the workers in coveralls who smell like grease and sweat, who don't speak in polished academic language but understand in their bones how things actually work. It's the legacy that says, when someone calls your idea stupid, it might be stupid. Or it might be so brilliant that it threatens the comfortable assumptions of people who've never had to make something work under impossible conditions. The only way to know is to try, to persist, to prove it in the crucible of reality rather than the comfort of theory. It's the legacy that says, in desperate times, the conventional wisdom that guides us in comfortable times can become a death sentence. Innovation under pressure requires not just intelligence but courage. The courage to question authority, to simplify rather than complicate, to prioritize function over form, and to trust your own judgment even when everyone with more education and more power is telling you you're wrong. Every time an engineer chooses simplicity over complexity, every time a designer prioritizes user needs over aesthetic prestige, every time someone without fancy credentials speaks up with a practical solution while experts debate theoretical perfection, Alexei Sudayev's ghost smiles in a Soviet factory that no longer exists, in a nation that has transformed beyond recognition, in a world that continues to need people willing to try stupid tricks that just might save everything. The PPSh-41 sits in museums now, behind glass, with plaques that tell its technical specifications and production numbers. But those plaques rarely tell the full story. They rarely mention the foreman who was dismissed as a fool. They rarely mention the designer who learned humility through grief. They rarely mention the teenage girls who assembled them by candlelight in besieged Leningrad. They rarely mention the commissar whose arrogance was shattered by reality. They rarely mention the millions of ordinary people whose ordinary hands created extraordinary things because the moment demanded it and no one else was going to save them. That's the story behind this weapon. That's the epilogue that matters. Not just what was built, but who built it, why it was necessary, and what it teaches us about human potential when circumstance strips away pretension and leaves only the raw question. Can you solve this problem? Or can't you? Alexei Sudayev answered that question with scrap metal, factory workers, and a design so simple it was mocked. And his answer helped win the greatest war in human history. That's not just an epilogue. That's a promise. A promise that genius is more democratic than society wants to admit, that solutions are more accessible than experts want to acknowledge, and that sometimes, just sometimes, the stupid tricks of ordinary people are exactly what saves the world. So the next time you face an impossible problem, the next time everyone with credentials tells you your solution is too simple, too crude, too stupid, remember the foreman in Moscow who heard the same thing, remember the 6 million weapons he created from nothing. Remember that he was right, and they were wrong, and the only way he proved it was by refusing to accept their judgment. Build your PPSh-41, whatever form it takes. Use the scrap metal you have, not the pristine materials you wish you had. Design for the people who need it most, not the critics who'll never use it. Make it simple enough that anyone can make it work, reliable enough that it functions when everything else fails, and practical enough that it solves the actual problem rather than the theoretical one. And when they call it stupid, smile the way Alexei Sudayev smiled and say, "Let me show you how it works."